All right, it is 12:01, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on why offshore wind, powering a reliable, affordable future. My name is Amanda Barker, and I am the Clean Energy Program Manager here at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I will be the one giving this presentation today. So just to quickly go over Zoom basics, everyone will be muted throughout the webinar, and we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. If you do have a question come up during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to go ahead and input your question, and I will be sure to get to it at the end of my presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent up in a follow-up email along with the slides. So definitely be on the lookout for that with the email that you use to register. And lastly, if you would like to use closed captions, you can do so by clicking CC at the bottom of your screen to enable those. Today's agenda, I'm going to start off by introducing Green Energy Consumers Alliance and the work that we do. I'm going to jump into why the Northeast is so well positioned to harness the power of offshore wind. I'm going to go into the current project status in the US. I'm going to talk about the benefits of offshore wind and then how you can support advancing offshore wind here in our region. And lastly, we'll open it up for questions. So in case you are not familiar with Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization based in both Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. So we work in both Mass and Rhode Island. And our mission is to empower consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. And we do that through both programs and advocacy. So we have a lot of consumer-facing educational programs around heat pumps, solar, electric vehicles, really any way that you can decarbonize your home. And then we also do policy advocacy. We have policy advocates in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island that spend a lot of their time at the state houses in both states pushing for us to pass policies to meet our climate mandates. And on that note, we also participate in the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which is a regional coalition working to advance the responsible development of offshore wind. And so we participate in the Massachusetts coalition, and I am the Rhode Island state lead for the Rhode Island State Committee of that coalition. So now to get into why the Northeast is so well positioned to harness the power of offshore wind. So we have a very densely populated coast with high energy demand near our shore. So you can see here along the coast of Boston and New York, going down to New Jersey and Maryland, there is a lot of power, right? So there's a lot of electricity demand along our coast. We also have some of the strongest winds in the entire world right off of our coast, which complements both solar and the winds are the strongest during the winter, which complements both solar and increased demand for electricity in the wintertime. So this middle picture here, you can see where there is red, that represents the strongest wind. Then we also have shallow waters on our continental shelf, which are ideal for installing turbines. Now, I want to mention that offshore wind and solar work really well together. So while solar is an important part of the renewable energy mix here in New England, and we're really proud that both Massachusetts and Rhode Island have been leaders on solar energy, it cannot meet the amount of power that we need on its own, but thankfully it pairs very nicely with offshore wind. So as you can see in this chart, offshore wind is strongest at night and in the fall and winter due to denser air creating higher wind speeds, whereas solar shines the most during the day and produces more during spring and summer months, since the sun is out shining more during those months. So they complement each other really well, and together, along with the hydro energy and battery storage, wind and solar can provide a really balanced energy mix for New England. Now to get into the status of large-scale offshore wind projects in the Northeast. We do have two smaller scale projects currently up and running. That's the Block Island Wind Farm, which is a 30 megawatt project off the coast of Rhode Island, and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which is a 12 megawatt project off the coast of Virginia. Those were the Block Island Wind Farm came first, and then the Virginia project. Those were the first offshore wind farms in the US, both quite small. But now we are starting to very excitingly see large-scale projects cross the finish line and deliver power to the Northeast. So those projects are the three listed here. The first is Vineyard Wind, which is contracted with Massachusetts. And we are very excited that construction for the project just finished last month. And this is a 62 turbine project off the coast of Massachusetts, and it will generate 800 megawatts of power, which is enough power for 400,000 homes. So this is really a game changer for clean energy in Massachusetts. It will eliminate 1.68 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, which is equivalent to removing 325,000 vehicles from the roads. So definitely a big deal. Right now, the final turbines are undergoing final commissioning and testing. And then once that's complete, the project will officially be up and running 11 years after its initial lease auction. So these projects do take quite a while to get up and running, and it's definitely been a long time coming for Vineyard Wind. The next project is Revolution Wind, which actually just began sending power to the grid last month. But it's not fully operational yet. But once complete, the project's 65 turbines will generate 704 megawatts of power for both Rhode Island and Connecticut. So the power is being split between those two states. It is the nation's first multi-state offshore wind project, and we hope that it serves as a model for future cross-state collaboration. Lastly, the South Fork Wind Project is a 132 megawatt, 12 turbine project off the coast of New York, and it became fully operational in July of 2024. And it produces enough clean electricity to power 70,000 homes. And it has been producing electricity very well. So in January of this year, South Fork Wind delivered a 52% capacity factor, which capacity factor is how much electricity a project actually produces compared to its maximum possible output. So on average, the project produced about half of its maximum output, and that's a very strong performance for offshore wind, and it's comparable to New York's most efficient gas power plants. In addition to that, the capacity factor actually exceeded 80% on several days in January. So that means that they were running close to full power, oftentimes when the system needed it most on cold winter days when the grid was stressed. Over the course of 2025, the South Fork Wind Project generated electricity on 99% of days and across 90% of all hours. So even if the output varies, it's almost always contributing something to the grid. So long story short, in summary, South Fork Wind is producing a lot of energy very consistently and often when it is needed most by the grid. And we expect similar performance from Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind once they're both fully online. Now, I wanted to quickly highlight a poll by the Barr Foundation that found majority support for offshore wind in southern New England. So, despite a tremendous amount of disinformation, which is the intentional spread of false information about offshore wind, oftentimes coming from or being funded by the fossil fuel industry, as well as misinformation, which is the repetition of the disinformation, oftentimes unknowingly. Despite all of that about offshore wind, there is still majority support for offshore wind in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. This poll surveyed over 1,200 residents in those states, and they found that these residents believe that embracing offshore wind will positively impact energy independence, job creation, and local economies, the fight against climate change, and energy prices. So I share this to say that, sometimes negative voices on offshore wind can seem very loud, but I want to emphasize that they are not the majority, and the majority of New Englanders see the value in offshore wind and support it. So we're very pleased to see majority support amongst residents in these three states. Now, the list of benefits from offshore wind really goes on and on. There are several benefits. It protects consumers from fossil fuel price spikes. It creates high quality local jobs. It keeps money here in New England. It improves public health. It increases winter energy reliability. And last but not least, it mitigates climate change. Today, I'm going to mainly focus on the reliability benefit in the wintertime, the affordability benefit and protection from fossil fuel price spikes, as well as the benefits to our local economy and keeping money here in our region. So more to come on those topics in the next few slides. So first, to get into winter reliability. Winter is when offshore wind has the greatest impact. New England is heavily reliant on natural gas for both electricity generation and home heating. And in winter, gas-fired power plants have to compete with demand for gas for home heating. And that competition drives up prices as well as increases the risk of reliability issues here in New England. At the same time, offshore wind generation is strongest in winter when demand is highest and cold weather strains the New England power grid. This is because cold weather creates higher wind speeds due to the denser air. So offshore wind is able to generate more when we need it most. A recent study by the Union of Concerned Scientists further proved this point. They found that Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind would have reduced New England's blackout risk by 55% if it had been operational during the winter of 2024-2025. And expanding to projects, so two more in addition to Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind, would have a 75% lower blackout risk. So offshore wind is really a game changer when it comes to winter reliability. And I also want to mention that ISO New England, our regional grid operator, also highlights offshore wind as the cornerstone of its winter reliability strategy. Their 2025 regional system plan identified offshore wind as the primary source in the queue, making up 44% of all proposed energy projects in New England. And they warn that delays to offshore wind increase risk during winter peak demand. So offshore wind is really a vital winter energy reliability solution. Just to further underscore that point and emphasize the abundance of offshore wind during the winter, here is a graph from a study conducted by the Charles River Associates. And this graph compares wind output with natural gas availability over the course of a year. So the blue line represents offshore wind, the green line represents onshore wind, and the red dotted line represents natural gas availability. You can see that when natural gas availability drops at the beginning and end of the year during the winter months, wind output is at its highest. So wind is really vital to wintertime reliability, to reducing outages and price spikes, and especially as we start to see intensified winter storms continue. So that was winter reliability from offshore wind. Now I would like to get into the price effects of offshore wind. And the first place to start here is that the price of electricity greatly depends on the price of natural gas. So electricity prices are impacted by supply and demand. And the electricity price is set by the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve. And that intersection represents the bid price of the most expensive generator that is operating at that moment to meet demand. And that generator is typically a natural gas power plant. Sometimes it can even be an oil power plant. And the reason why it's mostly a natural gas power plant is because natural gas has to bid into the wholesale electricity market at a price high enough to recover the cost of their fuel. And so therefore, the market clearing price is very closely linked to the price of natural gas fuel. And the market clearing price sets the price of electricity for everyone. So electricity prices that customers pay are directly related to that market clearing price that natural gas sets. Offshore wind, on the other hand, bids into the wholesale electricity market at or near zero, as it has no fuel costs to recover. So this orange line in this graph represents offshore wind bidding into the market at near zero. That addition of offshore wind shifts out the supply curve from this light blue line representing supply without offshore wind to this darker blue line, which represents supply with offshore wind. And when you shift the supply curve, you can see that it intersects the demand curve at a different point. And so by shifting it out, we reduce the point at which the supply curve intersects the demand curve. And the difference between the intersection of those two curves is the price reduction from adding offshore wind to the market. So offshore wind displaces the need to call in more expensive forms of generation, thereby lowering the overall market price and overall price of electricity. So as we talked about earlier, New England is heavily reliant on natural gas for both power generation and home heating. And the price of electricity very closely follows the price of natural gas. So this blue line in this graph represents natural gas prices, and the yellow line represents electricity prices. As you can see, natural gas prices are extremely volatile, which leaves the region vulnerable to spikes in electricity and gas bills. And as we've seen, global geopolitical events can have local consequences here in New England. For example, when Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, you can see that both natural gas prices and therefore electricity prices here in our region skyrocketed. And we're unfortunately seeing that same impact now with the current US war on Iran. Offshore wind, on the other hand, while it's bidding into the energy market at near zero, we pay for offshore wind through fixed price contracts outside of the market to pay for that offshore wind generation. So that means that we know what we are paying for offshore wind over the term of the contract, which is often 20 to 30 years. And that rate is locked in over those years. So it really is able to provide stability and predictability that volatile fossil fuel markets cannot offer us. So offshore wind brings price stability compared to the very volatile prices of natural gas, which can swing wildly, as you can see from this graph. So in summary, offshore wind acts as a hedge against natural gas volatility, reducing exposure to global fuel shocks and providing predictable electricity prices. Great. And now I'm going to go ahead and share a video that we created. Price suppression can get pretty technical pretty fast. And so we tried to create a simple video for you to hopefully grasp the concept. So I'm going to go ahead and press play. Let me just make sure this sound is optimized.
Welcome to our quick rundown on how renewable energy lowers the price of electricity on the wholesale market in New England, also known as price suppression. First, we need to understand supply and demand. Energy demand changes throughout the day and from season to season. Demand is met by different types of energy supply, like natural gas, renewables, and oil. The grid operator decides which types of supply will be called upon to meet demand based on their price, from cheapest to most expensive. On the far right, you can see that oil is the most expensive supply type. The next most expensive is typically natural gas. The 3 bars in the middle represent different natural gas plants, which can vary in price. The bar on the far left represents renewables, which bid into the market at near zero. That's because wind, water, and the sun are free, unlike oil and gas, which need to recover their fuel costs. So, the cheapest generators are called up first, and the price of the most expensive generator that is needed to meet demand sets the clearing price. The clearing price then sets the price of electricity for the entire wholesale market. As you can see, adding more renewable energy displaces more expensive forms of supply, effectively lowering the clearing price. So, in summary, renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro reduce the need to call on expensive fossil fuel plants, thereby lowering the price of electricity on the wholesale market. This effect is called price suppression, and it's why renewable energy is key to energy affordability.
Great. Awesome. So I hope that was helpful to reiterate what I was just talking about on the previous slides. And as a reminder, it's not just offshore wind that has that price suppression effect. It's all renewables. So solar, hydro. So yeah, really hope that video was helpful in understanding that concept. Now to move along to how offshore wind helps keep money in our region. So New England spends an average of $3 billion per year on natural gas for power generation, sending billions of dollars out of the region. And annual spending has even reached as high as $5 billion in some years, depending on fuel prices and winter weather conditions. And I want to flag that this graph, unfortunately, only goes out to 2022. But we are spending a lot more on gas in recent years, thanks to geopolitical conflicts like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, as well as Trump's recent war with Iran. And so that's just money leaving our regional economy, money that could otherwise be supporting local jobs, ports, supply chains, and long-term infrastructure investment here in our region. And by producing electricity here with offshore wind, we keep energy dollars circulating in New England, strengthening the regional economy rather than exporting wealth to out-of-region fossil fuel suppliers. Offshore wind also supports good-paying local jobs across construction, operations, manufacturing, and port services, further boosting our local economy and creating a green economy here in New England. Now, you have probably heard in the news that the Trump administration issued stop work orders for all 5 under construction wind projects here in the United States just before Christmas. Thankfully, all 5 stop work orders have been granted preliminary injunctions, and so all projects are back up under construction, some of which have actually completed construction, as we talked about earlier with Vineyard Wind. And the deadline for the federal government to appeal the preliminary injunctions has passed with no action from them. So it seems like the projects are able to move forward. Um, However, had these projects not been able to move forward, knock on wood, by the way, but had these projects not been able to move forward, it would have cost ratepayers an added $45 billion over the next 10 years. So these projects together represent $30 billion in investment, 15,000 jobs, and enough energy to power more than 2.5 million homes and businesses in our region. So it's really vital that these projects move forward. And our regional system operator, ISO New England, agrees. They are the ones responsible for maintaining reliability of the New England grid. And they have already included these projects in their planning and analysis, meaning that they are depending on them to come online, and cancellations would produce near-term electricity shortfalls and price spikes. So that would be a big problem for our grid's reliability as well as affordability. And so we are pleased to see that all 5 of the projects are back up under construction. And again, some of which are now producing electricity to the grid, which is really exciting to see. I also wanted to share this analysis that was done by Daymark Energy Advisors, where they found that if Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind had been fully operational during the winter of 2024 and 2025, ratepayers would have saved $400 million in just one season. So I feel like this statistic just really screams to how important offshore wind is to energy affordability, and why we need to keep pushing to get more projects online. Just to give you a global view of offshore wind, several countries across the globe recognize the value of offshore wind and have put in the effort to really develop these projects at large scales. So the United Kingdom has 16 gigawatts of offshore wind operational. They have 10.4 gigawatts currently under construction, and they have a goal of 76 gigawatts by the 2030s. The European Union has 39 gigawatts installed. They plan to reach 111 gigawatts by the 2030s and 317 gigawatts by 2050. And then China is the leading developer of offshore wind. They have 42.7 gigawatts installed, and they are continuing rapid expansion. They don't have a specific target, but they are deploying offshore wind rapidly. So this really speaks to how other countries see the value in offshore wind and are moving forward. And we really hope the US is able to catch up when we have a friendlier administration. But with that being said, there are certainly still things that can be done in the meantime, while we do have a more, hostile administration towards offshore wind. First things first, I want to mention the Awesome Yes to Wind campaign that is run by Climate Action Rhode Island. They do a lot of actions and campaigns just continuing to beat the drum on why offshore wind is so important. So definitely recommend, once we send around these slides, clicking that link to sign up for action alerts, how you can get involved, and also just following them on social media, and reposting their posts and things to just spread the word on the benefits of offshore wind. But there also are 2 important pieces of legislation right now in both Rhode Island and Massachusetts that need your support. The first of which is in Rhode Island. We currently have a bill that would establish an offshore wind procurement study commission, requiring Rhode Island to develop a clear plan to procure 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And the study commission would come together to really figure out how can we make the procurement of offshore wind more transparent, and make sure that, we're overcoming any barriers that we had even before the current administration, There were some issues with supply chain constraints causing project prices to have to be rebid and things like that. So how can we build in flexibility and build up the supply chain to ensure that that doesn't happen moving forward? Those are questions that, we hope the study commission will explore. And then in Massachusetts, there is a big affordability bill before the General Assembly right now that has been voted out of the House, and now it's with the Senate. And this bill has some pros and cons. There's definitely some things in there that we are fighting against, but it does have some great offshore wind measures in it that we support. So I've included the sections of the bill on offshore wind. The first is Section 22, which would require Massachusetts to establish a 10 gigawatt target of offshore wind by 2040. The Section 23 would create a clean energy procurement fund. This would be a fund managed by the state's Department of Energy Resources, and it would be funded by legislative appropriations, fees, and various different other sources. And the money would be intended for clean energy procurement and administration of procurement. And the next section, Section 24, is a pre-development and project acceleration program, which would be a state-led effort to accelerate offshore wind projects. And it would actually allow Massachusetts to co-invest or finance projects with developers. And the goals of this are to create faster timelines, reduce project risk, create stronger supply chains, workforce growth, and better pricing transparency. So those are all things that I hope the study commission in Rhode Island takes a close look at, doing in Rhode Island as well. One thing I want to note, something that is really important that we need to be focusing on in the meantime, is transmission infrastructure and making sure that the grid is ready to take on all of this offshore wind once it gets up and running. Right now, our transmission infrastructure cannot take on more offshore wind than 12 gigawatts. So we do need to be working on building out the grid to be able to handle additional offshore wind beyond that 12 gigawatt threshold. So there's certainly work to be done in the meantime, answering the tough questions of how we can get procurement right so that when the market is ready, both states are ready to procure more offshore wind. So in closing, offshore wind is not just a climate solution, it is a cost control and reliability strategy for New England. It keeps billions of dollars in the regional economy. It lowers wholesale electricity prices. It reduces exposure to volatile global fuel markets. It strengthens winter reliability when the grid is under the most stress. And it provides long-term price certainty for ratepayers, which is especially important when we have lots of geopolitical conflicts driving fossil fuel price volatility. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions that folks might have. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen and see what questions we have. All right. Okay. So we are getting some questions about what about the impacts of marine life? What about the impacts of offshore wind on marine life and birds? So this is a good question that we get asked often. And what we are seeing with these projects that are now up and running is that the base of the turbines are actually creating what we call an artificial reef effect, where we're starting to see, mussels start to grow on the base of the turbines and essentially form an artificial reef where fish are able to thrive and things like that. So far, all of the studies have actually shown a positive impact from the installation of these turbines in New England waters, which is really great to see. And we're seeing that same impact from studies across Europe, although we have different species here in New England. So it's great to see that that same effect is occurring here in our region. With respect to birds, the permitting and siting process for offshore wind is developed with birds in mind, where they intentionally site the turbines outside of the migration paths for the birds. There are also, mitigation measures that are implemented, such as, painting a blade to prevent or to make them more visible to birds, things like that. So wildlife mitigation is certainly something that is being implemented, and we're starting to see that there's actually been a benefit for marine life for sure. So thank you for that question. It's an important question, and just want to reiterate that all major wildlife organizations like the National Wildlife Federation and the Audubon Society support offshore wind because they recognize that the biggest threat to marine life and birds is climate change. And offshore wind is really the biggest lever that we can pull to mitigate climate change. All right, let's see, what else do we have? All right, it looks like someone is asking about the difference between the PPA price and the price suppression effect on the wholesale market. So this gets pretty technical pretty fast, but I will try my best to answer this question. So essentially, again, as I was saying earlier, offshore wind is paid for via a fixed power purchase agreement or PPA between the utility and the developer over 20 to 30 years. And at the same time, offshore wind also gets bid into the wholesale market at near zero, since, again, wind is free and doesn't have to recover fuel costs like oil and gas do. That brings down the overall wholesale market price, as we have to call on less dirty and expensive fossil fuel power plants, as the price suppression video hopefully explained. But utilities are indirectly exposed to that market price. And then they have to bridge the gap between the power purchase agreement price and the wholesale market price, with the difference between the two being what gets passed on to consumers' supply side of their utility bill. So another way to think of it is gross versus net costs. The gross cost is the PPA price, whereas the net cost is the PPA price minus the price suppression effect on the wholesale market price, and what the consumer ultimately ends up paying. So I hope that helps answer that question. Like I said, it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. Let's see. It looks like someone is asking about, are the photos of the offshore wind farms 1 mile apart, like Revolution Wind, or are they closer together? Just trying to get a good mental picture of them. Yeah, so I don't know about the ones in Europe. I think you might be referring to the photo I had on the slide about offshore wind globally. But I know that all projects here in New England do have to be sited 1 mile apart from each other to allow for easier navigation for fishing vessels and things like that. So I know that that's a requirement for projects here in our region. All right. It looks like someone is asking about the Trump administration's impact on projects. So I did touch on that a bit earlier. The Trump administration did try to did successfully issue stop work orders for the 5 projects that are currently under construction. in the United States. Thankfully, all 5 of those projects were granted preliminary injunctions and able to continue construction. And the deadline for the federal government to appeal has passed. So, knock on wood, those 5 projects seem to be able to move forward. So that's Vineyard Wind, Sunrise Wind, Empire Wind, and Revolution Wind. And I think there's one more that I might be missing there. But those projects we are expecting to come online, some of which have already come online, which is really exciting to see. As far as future projects, unfortunately, beyond those projects that are under construction and have all of their federal permits, there are projects in the pipeline, like South Coast Wind, for example, that are currently waiting on some federal permits from the Trump administration that they just have sort of gone MIA on. So that is where we are seeing the real impact, is a delay in terms of federal permitting, that, we unfortunately seems like we need to wait for a friendlier administration to be able to move forward with those. But however, as I was saying earlier, there are things we can be doing in the meantime to make sure that we get things right when offshore wind is, when the market is ready. How can we be ready to go immediately? So things like looking at transmission and procurement policy, to make sure that when the market is ready, Rhode Island and Massachusetts are ready. Let's see. It looks like some people are asking about the PPA price for some of these projects. So for Revolution Wind, the PPA price is $99 a megawatt hour, and the PPA price for Vineyard Wind, I think, is $74 a megawatt hour. So those are actually steals compared to what some of the prices have been in the wholesale electricity market this past winter. We've seen prices an average, I think January was around $200 a megawatt hour. And then during times when the grid was really stressed, during, cold snaps, we saw the wholesale electricity price skyrocket to above $1,000. So these are really, good deals that will really help bring down prices for New Englanders. All right. It looks like people are asking to see all of the benefits listed. So we're going to send around the slides that will include all of the benefits that we mentioned. So definitely be on the lookout for that, as well as this recording. All right, someone is asking about maintenance of offshore wind. So there is a maintenance contract for the lifetime of the project, where they have crews going out and, maintaining the turbines and things like that. I'm not super in the weeds on exactly how that works, but I do know that there are vessels and crews that go out regularly to maintain the projects. Great. Okay, and where can we find the animation on price suppression? So we will send that link out to you with the follow-up resources so that you can easily click on that. And we hope that you will share it with all of your friends, because we're trying to really spread the word on price suppression here in New England from offshore wind. Are there any size restrictions, or how big are some of the blades? Great question. I once knew this, and I don't have it at the tip of my finger, but I know that they are huge. Like, we went and saw the South Fork wind turbine and up in person, and like, it towers above you. I think they're more than the length of a football field. And yeah, just really massive structures. And they continue to get bigger as the technology continues to develop, so that they're able to, you know, have even higher capacity factors. So yeah, maybe I'll get the exact answer for you and send that in the follow-up email. Let's see. All right. I think that's all of the questions. I'll hang on here for 1 or 2 more minutes to see if anyone has any other questions. How much of the equipment is manufactured in the US? So there has been a lot of supply chain development starting to come to the US. You know, the Port of Providence has a cabling manufacturer for the turbines. There are even some components that come from, you know, southern states. The Oceanic Network had a really great study that shows the supply chain for US offshore wind projects that I'd be happy to send around in the follow-up materials. Um, However, we really need the industry to continue to develop out here for the supply chain to continue to develop out here, if that makes sense. So while there is some manufacturing happening in the US, you know, in the Port of Providence, the new London port is where a lot of the turbines are being built. The advanced foundation components for all of Ørsted's projects were developed in the Port of Providence. And then the Vineyard Wind components were developed in a port in New Bedford. We really need more development to continue to see that equipment being manufactured here in our ports. All right. I am not seeing any more questions come in the chat, so maybe I'll just wait 1 more minute, but if not, I'm happy to give you all some time back to your day, and please be on the lookout for the follow-up materials. Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. And like I said, we will be sending out a follow-up email shortly with all of these resources.